Hello, and welcome to Telling Your Research Story. My name is David Polson, and I teach at the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism at Michigan State University. In this first week, we're going to discuss the value of researchers learning communication skills and practice some translating strategies. And in subsequent weeks, you will create your own story, complete with visual elements. But that first question, why, is a good one. Let's establish that need for that translational mindset. Why is it beneficial for researchers and scientists? And you could say that perhaps simple obligation plays a role. Research is supported by public dollars, and the argument can be made that we owe the public something directly for the research that we produce. I think perhaps a greater motivating factor would be simple altruism. No one got into research to make a lot of money. Most of us are motivated by this public service element. And communicating your research to a broader audience expands the impact of what you do. Elsewhere in this week's lesson, you'll see a video of Joan Rose, a water researcher here at Michigan State University who got involved in a water quality challenge in the city of Milwaukee. And she got involved because she was an expert in an organism called Cryptosporidium, and it had a huge impact on that community. And there's another video of Mike Weber, a retired agricultural researcher who views communicating the life work of his colleagues and of himself as a way of enhancing the value of their legacy. Another reason is researchers and scientists have great stories to tell. It's wonderful content. What we do in the field and the lab can be fascinating, so why not share it with others so that they too can be fascinated? The pursuit of truth can be a thrilling mystery story filled with twists and turns. So share it. But perhaps the greatest reason is simple pragmatism. Funders want research with impact, and the better you are at communicating the value of research to a variety of publics, the greater the impact your research can have. In short, a good story can help you get grants and other funding. Of course, the greatest challenge we may have is translating jargon. Now, the public isn't stupid. The challenge that we have is that we speak in a language that our colleagues recognize, but the general public may not. And that happens in a lot of fields. In fact, I often ask students, what is the most technical story that you can think of that's produced for a general audience? And so often I'll get the answer, economics. And people think that that's a difficult subject for an expert to translate to the public. Or public policy. For instance, translating federal health care is an extremely challenging issue. To do so in a way that the public would understand and the public would care. Food systems is another complicated issue, as is certainly politics and of course science. In fact, what kind of science? For instance, me personally, I have a great deal of difficulty challenging particle physics, and that's a tricky one. The key here to realize is that readers aren't dumb. Sometimes we get frustrated with readers and viewers that they don't understand that we're working on, but they are capable of understanding complexity. We just gave an example of how they can understand the complexity of a sports game. The key is finding that common language that you both share. Now, the other thing is if you have difficulty doing that, you need to recognize that doesn't necessarily mean you're a poor communicator or you don't have communication skills. You are capable of explaining complexity. Again, what you need to do is to find that common language that you share with readers. So, let's look at some tips for killing jargon. Very first thing I would tell you is don't worry about the jargon. Write with the jargon. Communicate with the jargon, at least in your first draft. The key is to write your first draft of your story fast and don't worry about the jargon. Use the tools that are at your disposal. But in subsequent rewrites, slow down. Focus on translating the jargon. Your story is out there. Now it's your translation challenge. So look at everything that's either bureaucratic or obscure or special to your field that no one else would understand and focus on translating it. Avoid bureaucratic names and acronyms. names of centers and bureaucracies and agencies and convoluted alphabetical acronyms that no one understands really bog down a story and make it difficult for the reader. So do what you can to avoid that. And then and also short words are best. Always try to find the simplest, shortest word to tell the story, the shortest sentence to tell the story, and even shorter paragraphs. The last piece of advice I have you, though, is to tell your mother. It's a huge key. Tell your story as if you're relating it to your mother or to a brother or a spouse or anyone, particularly someone who doesn't have expertise in your particular field. You want a conversational tone. So when you get done with your piece, ask yourself, would my mom understand what I have to say? The other thing about telling your story is to avoid vague language. And we use vague language quite a bit to actually cover up stuff that we don't particularly know. But you want to be as precise as possible. So you want to avoid phrases like, it has long been known, because that doesn't really tell us much. Who's long known this, and what is the it that really has been known? Often when you see a phrase like, it has long been known, what you're really saying is something like, I haven't bothered to look up the reference. Okay, so provide that detail. Or, it is believed is another one. Who believes this thing? It is believed can often be translated to, this is what I think's going on. Okay, well, make a precise reference to who thinks or who believes the particular issue that you're relating. Or, it is generally believed. What does that mean? Well, I think this, and a couple of other guys think so too. Generally believed doesn't tell us much. Here's another example. It's not unreasonable to assume. Well, maybe that means if you believe this, you'll believe anything. Or how about this one? This is my favorite. Correct within a magnitude of x, which also can simply be translated to wrong, but I want to talk about it anyway. Okay, we're going to take a break now. I'm going to tell you a story. This is one of my favorite stories. It's based at my university. And what you see on the screen right now is exactly what you think those are. Those are dead robins. But these are world famous robins. And in fact, if you come to my university at Michigan State, you can see these robins in a drawer in the museum. And they had a huge impact on my life. They had a huge impact on the lives of everyone in the United States. And I would even go so far as to say these robins had a global impact. And I'm going to tell you what that impact is and why you should know about these robins at the end of my story. But first, let me tell the story. Okay, these robins were collected by this guy in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. His name is George Wallace, and he was an ornithologist here at MSU. And in fact, it's probably not correct to say that he collected these robins. They were mostly collected by his students. And they would be walking to class and they would find these robins dead alongside the sidewalk or underneath trees. Or if they weren't dead, they were trembling, they were convulsing. And they thought, wow, this can't be good. And so they take them to their professor, the ornithologist, and said, what the heck's going on here? And Wallace didn't know, but he figured, geez, this is right in my field. I ought to figure this out. And his first theory was that they were suffering from some neurological disease because before they died, they were also often convulsing. But he found out that wasn't true, that there must be another explanation after he did several experiments. And so he then took a great leap and he thought maybe it's linked to another dying organism at Michigan State. And these were elm trees. Okay, and they were not only dying at Michigan State University, they were dying across the United States. And it was a huge tragedy because these trees defined communities in downtowns and shady campuses like ours here at MSU. And as they died, people were heartbroken because they were gorgeous trees. In fact, I've heard them described as giant green fireworks erupting from the ground. And their death was linked to the Dutch elm beetle that spread a fungal disease. And the solution, or the hoped-for solution at that time, was to spray them with a pesticide. And so they were sprayed very heavily with DDT. Here you can see a sprayer at my campus directly spraying a tree, but they were also sprayed from the air. Airplanes flew over the campus in the city and dropped clay pellets filled with DDT. And students at that time would talk about walking to class and crunching these pellets underneath their feet. So Wallace theorized that there was some kind of a connection between the death of the elm trees and perhaps the way we treated the Dutch elm beetle. And in fact, he and other scientists worked out this theory of biomagnification. And most of you probably have learned this in high school biology, but if you haven't, let me give you a quick understanding of how it would work in this particular instance. So the idea would be that the DDT came on the leaves, and the leaves would fall to the ground, and eventually they would rot. And when they rotted, they left behind a tiny amount of DDT. Now, when Wallace first began experimenting with a link to DDT in the birds, he'd spray them with a little bit of DDT, and it didn't seem to have much of an effect to them. But he found also that the leaf litter year after year would build up with DDT. It would become concentrated. And so every year a little more DDT was left behind. And then along would come an earthworm, and an earthworm would eat some of that leaf litter, that decaying leaf litter, and picked up a little bit of DDT. Now, it wasn't enough to cause it any harm. It may never have felt sick. But then a little while later, it picked up a little more, and a little more, and a little more. And it began to accumulate this DDT in its bodies. And then, of course, along came the robins. And the robins would eat one or two earthworms and not have any particular problem. But they would pick up a little bit of DDT that would stay in their bodies. And then they might eat a dozen or more earthworms and pick up a little more, and then perhaps hundreds. And with every earthworm that they ate, the DDT load got greater and greater in their bodies until it eventually reached a tipping point and caused them great health problems. Okay, so this was an extremely controversial finding at the time. And Wallace was under a lot of pressure. There were pesticide manufacturers who were upset with what he was doing and called into question his research because they said, after all, he wasn't a chemist. He was just an ornithologist. What would he know about what's going on here? So he's under a lot of pressure, but story has a happy ending. He was eventually recognized for his work. He didn't lose his job or anything like that. Okay, so that's the end of that story. Sort of. Remember, I told you I want to tell you about the impact of those robins on your life. First, we're going to talk a little bit, though, about the hooks in that story. These are narrative hooks and tools that you can find out elsewhere in this class. There's a list of them. But let's go through a few right now. First of all, I started my story with a picture, and you may recall that I left that picture up there for a while before I started my story. I wanted you to look at it and wonder, what the heck is he going to talk about? What do these dead birds have to do with the story that he's got in mind? And then I looked a little bit at audience identification because I often tell this story to university groups. So I kind of like to build in their minds this connection to the university, the reference to the professor, to the students walking to class, and finding dead birds or crunching pellets of DDT underfoot. And then I looked at opportunities to build word pictures in your mind. And so probably the most acute one that I built had to do with those elm trees. And if you can remember, I described the elm tree as a giant green firework exploding from the ground. And I wanted to use that as a technique for you to understand what was at stake, that these were beautiful trees that had been threatened. And then I told some anecdotes. I told the anecdotes about the students picking up the birds and the students crunching the pellets and the fact that we actually flew airplanes over the university and dropped DDT down on it. And I gave you a little bit of an element of conflict, which often spurs reader interest. I didn't give you a lot about that because that's an interesting story, probably a story by itself, the pressure that Wallace was under because of his findings. And then the last thing I would say is the first thing. I gave you a cliffhanger. Remember, I told you that those birds had an impact on your life, and if you stuck around for the rest of my story, I was going to explain to you what that impact was. So here's the impact. There was a woman by the name of Rachel Carson who heard of George Wallace's studies and research and that of other similar scientists doing similar biomagnification work. And Rachel Carson began corresponding with George Wallace to learn more about what he was doing. And eventually she published an extremely influential book that you may have heard of called Silent Spring. And in Silent Spring, she cites much of what Wallace had found and discovered. And Silent Spring had an enormous impact. It had an enormous impact on policymakers who passed laws and made decisions. It had enormous impact on the public who began to support those laws and the decisions that policymakers made, or else drove those themselves. Some people would argue that Rachel Carson launched the modern environmental movement in the United States. And it had an impact not only in this country, in the United States, but you can argue that that awareness also grew elsewhere. It had a global influence. So I like to make the point that these robins, these world famous robins, helped change the world. And this is the guy that did it. He provided the ammunition to change the world by using those robins in his research. But the other element here is the communicator. He may have provided the ammunition. I would say that Rachel Carson, the communicator, was the one who lit the fuse. And by taking that research and turning it into a story, she helped change the world. And that's why it's important for researchers to understand the value of story in telling their story. Okay, let's talk a little more about that story. First of all, I had a goal in that story, and my primary goal was simply to explain how biomagnification works. I talked to a lot of different groups, and they don't all remember their high school biology, and I hope that when I'm done talking, they understand biomagnification and will never forget it again. So I actually wrote that down. This is my goal in telling the story. But I had a couple secondary goals too. One was how science works. And it was very subtle, but you can remember at the story at the beginning I made a reference to George Wallace making a mistake or went down a blind alley. He thought that these birds were suffering from a neurological disease, and that was wrong. And the reason I told that little piece is I wanted to drive home the fact that this is how science works, that you go down a couple blind alleys before you actually find out what's going on. And I think that that's a misperception among the public, that a blind alley is a failed effort at science, when blind alleys is, frankly, a lot of what science is all about. Okay, so I would argue that you should write a single sentence with the goal of your piece, and you don't even have to use that sentence when you tell that story, but keep it in mind as a guidepost for your focus. Remember, you're not telling everything you've discovered in your research. There may be lots of stories in your research. Just tell one of them. Don't tell everything. Okay, and then the other thing is what's the most interesting aspect of your research? Start there. You need to grab eyeballs and interest before you can go into greater detail of what you discovered and how you found it. And this is difficult often for scientists and researchers because they're used to writing studies, and studies most often start with context and background and build to discovery. If you're telling a story to a policymaker, if you're telling a story to the public, engage them first with the most interesting thing you found. Background and context is important. Just hold it off till later. Another thing to emphasize is, why is your research important to people? Be very specific about that. Make the link between what you're doing to actual people. You can't always do that, but do it when you can. And then find a personal anecdote, something interesting that happened to you that will work as a little story within the bigger story. So that's what big stories are really about, a series of little stories. And so look for those interesting little anecdotes that make the story more personal. And then look at the opportunities to write analogy, metaphor, or simile. Again, that whole idea of painting a picture with words. You want to show pictures, but you want to tell pictures too. Look for elements of conflict. They don't have to be big ones, but they are also something that drive readers' interest. What are the theories that disagree with your research, and why might your research be one of multiple answers? It's okay to tell that. And then if there's a cliffhanger that you can hint at through your story, particularly at the beginning and the middle, and then deliver it at the end, look for an opportunity to build to that cliffhanger that will maintain reader interest. Okay, so a famous dictum in writing is to omit needless words. The idea is to increase your understanding per word. And so I would argue that as you do your multiple rewrites, as you're trying to translate that jargon, always look for the opportunity to omit needless words, to write the shortest sentences and paragraphs that you can. Okay, that doesn't mean to tell a short story. Okay, shorter is not necessarily short. You can tell a very, very long story. Just tell that long story in as short a period of time as you can. Okay, so let's do a couple exercises. Here's some sentences that I pulled out of a white paper. Just straight up raw sentences. And what I want you to do is take a little bit of time to look at each one and then practice writing it shorter. So you can see this very first one. Planting dates for crops are strongly dependent on the timing of rainfall as well as the temperature range. Okay, that's an 18-word sentence. Can you write it shorter than that? Give it a try. Okay, so this was my effort. I cut that sentence in half. When to plant crops depends on rain and temperature. Does that tell exactly what that other sentence says? I would argue it does, and it does it in half the words. Maybe you did better. Did you get less than 9 words? Let's try another one. Okay, this is a 32-word sentence. GCFSI is seeking proposals that would help to reduce the vulnerability and increase capacity of smallholder farms to adapt to climate variability and climate change in water-stressed regions in developing countries. Okay, 32 words. Can you make it 30? Can you make it 20? Give it a shot. How'd it go? This was my effort. I got her under 20. We seek ways to help small farmers adapt to climate change and variability in dry regions of developing countries. Maybe you got it shorter than 19, but if you got it shorter than 32, that's great. And you'll notice that, remember I talked about that acronym, that jargony acronym, those letters that nobody really understands but the people who are part of that particular community? I completely got rid of it and simply referred to GCFSI as we. You can't always do that, but you can often do that. Let's try another phrase. For the foreseeable future, food provisioning and exchange in urban areas will rely heavily on what is referred to as the informal or traditional sector. 25 words, see if you can beat it. How'd it go? Let's see what I did. Oh my heavens, I got less than half of those words. Obtaining food in cities will rely heavily on informal markets. How'd you do? Did you get her under 25? Did you get it under 10? Let's try one more. This is a 38-word sentence. Boy, that's a mouthful. Let's give it a try. Because of a variety of constraints, many market information systems that rely on mobile phones to send price information to farmers and to facilitate selling crops directly to distant buyers have not yet attracted widespread use by farmers. That's a long sentence. We've repeated the word farmers several times. I felt out of breath at the end of that sentence. And that's a good test for you too. Read your writing out loud. If you're out of breath or if you're stumbling over words, you need to rewrite that sentence. Those are excellent flags for difficult sentences to talk about and write. Okay, how'd you do? Looks like I got 14 on this one. A variety of constraints keep farmers from using mobile phones to sell their crops. it sure was a lot easier for me to read aloud. And I think it says the same thing. And maybe we'd have an argument over that. Maybe the person who wrote that sentence would have an argument about that. So maybe we'd have to negotiate something between 14 and 38. But to me, I think 14 does it. And the only way you can get good at doing this is just practice, practice, practice. Look for your long sentences. Challenge yourself to shorten them up. Look at it as a game. It's almost like doing crossword puzzles. Okay, another way of shortening your sentences is try to identify those that are written in passive voice. So passive voice, here's an excellent example. Bill received a bullet shot from the gun that Ellen fired. Okay, so receiving a bullet is very much a passive action. So if you want to change from passive to active, first look for a noun that's doing something. And in this case, Ellen is the one who's doing something. She's the noun that's doing something. Now let's give her a strong verb to do that something with. So here's how I change this passive sentence to an active one. Okay, I ask myself, who's doing something? Ellen. I'm going to put her at the beginning of my sentence. Okay, I'm going to make Ellen the subject, and I'm giving her a strong verb to complete the action. And there it is. Ellen shot Bill. I put the noun that's doing something, gave it a strong verb to do something, and then explained what that something was being committed against. Okay, we went from 11 words to 3 words. Here's another one. The volleyball team was congratulated by Tom Izzo. Who's doing something? Well, in this case, it's Tom, our football coach. Well, what's he doing? He's congratulating. Well, who's he congratulating? The volleyball team. The key again is to identify the noun that's actually doing something. Being congratulated is a very passive action, okay? But congratulating, now that's an active verb. Tom Izzo congratulated the volleyball team. Here's another one. You give this one a shot. Bicycles are the mode of transportation for millions of Chinese. What's the noun that's doing something? Or in this case, I would argue it's a noun phrase. Okay, it might be several words that's doing something. So identify who's doing something and find a strong verb for them to do that action. Okay, how did it go? Get a simple sentence written off of that one? I would argue that the action that the people who are doing something are millions of Chinese. What do? They ride. And what do they ride? They ride bicycles. Look how much shorter that sentence is, more concise it is, and how much more communication, impact, and power it has. It's a common occurrence to see 2 or 3 people on one bike. Give that one another shot. Who's doing something? What is it that they're doing? Start your sentence with the people who are actively doing something. Got it figured out? 2 or 3 people are doing something. What do? They ride one bike. We got a modifier in here, and it's an important one. They often ride one bike. We want to make sure that we don't lose that piece of communication. But again, look how much tighter that sentence is. Look how shorter it is. And look at the communication power it has versus the previous sentence. One more try. Tears poured from his eyes and ran down his cheeks. Who's doing something? What's a powerful verb that represents the action that's being done? Give that one a try. Okay, how'd that go? This is a little tricky one because we don't exactly know the subject that's doing something. All we know is there's a his involved. So who's doing something here we have to refer to simply as he. But I like this one because it's a good example of the power of tight writing. Look at that. It's really all you have to say. He cried, a 2-word sentence, a powerful, powerful sentence. We have the subject, someone who's doing an action, actually doing something, and we have a strong verb explaining that action. He cried. Okay, so for the remainder of this lesson, what we want you to do is a little bit of translational practice. Within week 1, you'll see a story, you'll see a study referred to as the Python study. This is a science study, and it's very, very short, and I'd like you to read that. And then after reading it, I would like you to translate it. And you don't have to translate the whole thing. Just think about what you can do to attract a general interest reader immediately to that story. There's some tips on how to do that and how to think about that story. And when you get that all done, when you get a couple paragraphs written, post them to the class forum so that others can see what you've done and maybe give you some input on your effort. And then after that, you can click on a story written by a professional journalist about that particular study to get a sense of how he approached it and why he approached it in the way that he did. But don't cheat and click on that thing first. You want to give it your best shot and compare what you did with how that professional journalist did. And there's one other step that you might be interested in doing. There's an audio clip of that journalist discussing his approach to that story and why he did what he did. And you can listen to that as well. And then your homework assignment for before the start of week 2 is what I want you to do is to begin to write your own research story. Take a look at some of the work that you're doing and decide what might make a good simple story. Again, don't think about writing your entire story or your entire body of research. Find an element that you find interesting. Maybe it's the element that you talk to a spouse every night when you come home from work or to someone else. But select that and let's begin to build that story. Okay? Don't, think about in terms of short sentences, getting rid of jargon, engaging the public with some of those hooks and story tools that I had mentioned, using word imagery, telling anecdotes, reveal a little bit of personality about yourself. Give that a try and post it sometime during the next week and give an opportunity for those of us here at Michigan State to maybe give you a little bit of reaction to it, and for your colleagues in this class who are also taking it to provide some insight and perspective. Have a little bit of a thick skin. Don't worry about criticism. Writing is rewriting, and writing is getting input from others to see if you're communicating. And you're never really done with a story. You just have to abandon it and quit writing it. So good luck to you on that, and we'll see you next week.